The night was heavy with August heat in Calverton, a mid-sized city pressed between industrial flatlands and a river that had not run clean in 40 years. The kind of city where the infrastructure sagged under the weight of neglect, where the courthouse steps were stained with old protests that nobody remembered anymore, and where the police department had long since stopped pretending to serve the community it occupied. It was the kind of city where bad things happened in plain sight and good people learned to look away, because looking directly had consequences. 3 in the morning, and State Route 9 was nearly empty. A stretch of 4-lane highway slicing through the dark eastern edge of town, lit by orange sodium lamps that buzzed and flickered at irregular intervals, casting pools of amber light between long stretches of shadow. Claire Navarro drove a gray 2019 Honda Accord, unremarkable in every way that mattered. The car was registered to a woman named Linda Espinoza at a duplex address on Ferndale Court on the west side of Calvert. The registration was current. The insurance was valid. The tags were clean. The car was doing 52 miles per hour in a posted 55 zone, signal on, both hands on the wheel at the precise 10-2 position of someone who had no interest in attracting attention. She had been driving for 6 hours. Her eyes were steady. Her jaw was set. She wore a gray hoodie over a plain white shirt, her dark hair pulled back tight, a reusable coffee cup wedged into the center console holder, a leather messenger bag on the passenger seat, and absolutely nothing in the car that should have drawn any attention from any police officer operating within the boundaries of his legal authority. The lights came on behind her before she reached the Delmonico overpass. Red and blue strobes cutting through the dark. One short burst of siren, the kind that says pull over immediately and does not ask. Claire checked the rearview mirror. She did not grip the wheel tighter. She did not reach for her phone. She did not check her expression in the mirror or rehearse her words or do any of the dozens of things that innocent people do when they see police lights and feel the sudden cold flood of bureaucratic fear. She simply guided the Honda to the right shoulder with smooth, unhurried precision, came to a complete stop, put the car in park, killed the engine, rolled down both front windows to exactly halfway, placed both hands on top of the steering wheel, and waited. The patrol unit sat behind her for a full 90 seconds before the driver door opened. She watched the figure in the rearview mirror the way a person watches a weather system forming on the horizon. Deliberate, clinical, measuring. The officer was Sergeant Marcus Holt, 41 years old, 17 years on the Calverton Police Department, currently assigned to the midnight patrol unit that covered the eastern corridor. He walked the way men walk when they have worn authority so long it has fused to their bones. Wide gait, shoulders rolled slightly back, one hand resting on the radio clipped to his vest, the other loose near his service weapon in the way of someone who has practiced the gesture until it became unconscious theater. He was a broad man, not tall but dense, with a face that had once been handsome in a blunt, uninteresting way and was now just blunt. A jawline hardened by years of resentment. Eyes that moved with practiced assessment, scanning the car, the plates, the figure in the driver's seat, calibrating something fast and private. He stopped at the driver's window. Looked down. License, registration, and proof of insurance, he said. Not a question. Not even a sentence, really. Just a sequence of demanded objects delivered with the particular boredom of a man who had no actual interest in the documents themselves. Claire did not move quickly. She moved deliberately, which was different. She reached with her right hand into the glove compartment, removed the small plastic sleeve with the registration and insurance card, tucked inside it, then reached into the back pocket of the messenger bag for the slim wallet. She drew out the driver's license and held all 3 items out the window without turning her head to look at him directly. He took them without acknowledgement. The license read, Linda Espinoza. The address on Ferndale Court. Date of birth indicating 34 years old. Brown hair. Brown eyes. 5'6". Holt studied the license for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked at the woman behind the wheel, then back at the license, in the way of someone making a determination that had nothing to do with the documents in his hand. Step out of the vehicle, he said. Claire turned her head to look at him then. Direct and even, no register of surprise in it. Can I ask what the reason for the stop is, officer? Failure to maintain lane, Holt said. I'd like to note for the record that I have not crossed any lane markings since I entered this road, Claire said. Not heated. Not challenging in any theatrical way. Factual, the way someone reads a statement from a page. Something crossed Holt's face. A minor compression of features, like a door closing behind the eyes. I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Claire opened the door and stepped out. She stood beside the car, hands visible, posture neutral. She was exactly 5'6". The hoodie was loose enough to conceal very little, and Holt's eyes moved over her with the evaluating efficiency of someone checking boxes rather than performing a genuine safety assessment. "Hands on the roof," he said. She complied, both palms flat on the roof of the Honda, fingers spread, face forward. "You been drinking tonight?" "No." "You come from somewhere or going somewhere?" "Passing through." "Passing through where exactly?" "Calverton," she said. "On my way to Columbus." Holt walked a slow circle around the exterior of the car, flashlight moving across the windows, the door seams, the rear lights, the trunk seal. He was looking for something, or giving the performance of looking for something, which in his experience amounted to the same thing because the outcome was always already decided before the looking began. He came back to stand behind her, close enough that she could hear the static crackle of his radio. "I'm going to conduct a search of the vehicle," he said. "On what basis?" "I detected the odor of marijuana." "There is no marijuana in this vehicle." "That's for me to verify," he said. There was a pause. The sodium lamp above them hummed and shivered. Down the road, a single truck passed, its headlights sweeping across the scene and disappearing. The world felt very empty and very specific all at once. "I'm not consenting to a search," Claire said. "You don't need to." His voice carried a particular flatness. The flatness of a man who had said these words so many times they had worn smooth, like river stones. The flatness of someone who knew that in this city, at this hour, on this stretch of road, the word of a sergeant on the midnight patrol was the only word that would ever matter. He reached into the patrol car and retrieved a pair of blue nitrile gloves. Snapped them on. It was a practiced motion. What happened next took 11 seconds. Holt opened the passenger door of the Honda. He stood inside the frame of it, back partially to his dashcam's angle, his body blocking a clean line of sight to the passenger footwell. His right hand moved into the space between the seat and the door, into the gap beside the messenger bag. His body shifted, a compression of movement so casual and so rehearsed that a person watching from a distance might have believed he was simply checking the compartment. A small Ziploc bag appeared. It was sealed, and inside it was a white powder compressed into a rough, uneven brick no bigger than a lighter. He placed it with purpose between the bottom edge of the seat and the floor mat, then withdrew his hand, straightened, and turned back to look at Claire with an expression of studied neutrality. "I need you to step to the rear of your vehicle," he said. She did not move immediately. "What did you find?" "Step to the rear of the vehicle, please." She walked to the rear bumper. Holt held up the bag. Even in the amber half-light, the white powder was visible through the clear plastic. "Found this in your passenger seat area," he said. "Cocaine, looks like. Maybe 2-3 grams." Claire looked at the bag. She looked at him. Her face did not fracture. Not in the way faces fracture when a person is surprised or horrified by evidence they did not put in their own car. It did not crumble. It did not tighten into frantic denial. It stayed exactly as it had been since she'd stepped out of the vehicle. Measured, attentive, deliberate. "You found that in my vehicle," she said. "That's correct." "In the passenger seat area?" "That's what I said. After I told you I did not consent to a search. Probable cause search based on detected odor. You're being detained for possession of a controlled substance." He reached for his cuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Claire turned around slowly. Her hands came behind her. She felt the cold metal of the cuffs close over her wrists. She heard them ratchet in that precise, irrevocable way. The sound of it was not the sound of defeat. It was a different sound altogether, though Holt would not understand that for another 47 minutes. "You have the right to remain silent," he began. "I know my rights," she said quietly. He finished the Miranda recitation anyway, in the rote, uninflected tone of a man who had delivered it so many times that the words had lost all grammatical meaning. She stood still through all of it, hands cuffed at the small of her back, the night air sitting heavy and humid against her skin, the distant sound of the city somewhere behind the dark. Holt called it in. "Felony drug stop, 1 female detained, evidence recovered." His voice was calm on the radio. Comfortable. This was routine for him. This was a Tuesday. She was placed in the back of the patrol unit. The messenger bag was taken as evidence. The car was called for an impound. Holt returned to the driver's seat, and they pulled away from the shoulder, leaving the gray Honda alone under the buzzing sodium lamp, its windows still halfway down in the way she had left them. Inside the patrol car, the separation screen between the front and rear seats was a scratched, yellowed sheet of polycarbonate. Claire sat behind it with her hands cuffed and her back straight and her eyes forward. She did not ask questions. She did not speak. She did not make the sounds people make when they are panicked or angry or trying to convince a stranger of their innocence. She watched the road through the windshield the way someone watches a route they have memorized. Holt's eyes found the rearview mirror twice. Both times she was looking forward, not at him, not at her hands, not at the polycarbonate screen between them, just forward. He found himself slightly irritated by the quality of her stillness. Most people broke by now, at least a little. Most people begged, or cried, or started building their case out loud, rehearsing their defenses for an audience that was already uninterested. This woman did none of that. She simply sat there with the particular patience of someone who was waiting for something specific to happen. The Calverton Police Department's central processing facility was a low, beige institutional building on Merchant Street, 4 blocks from the main courthouse. At this hour, the night shift was running lean. A desk sergeant named Foley, who was 58 years old and 11 months from retirement and had learned to expect nothing from this building and therefore received nothing. A processing officer named Delgado, 23, still new enough to be occasionally troubled by things, not yet worn smooth enough to stop noticing. And now Holt, bringing in his midnight collar with the particular swagger of a man who was already composing the story he would tell later. Claire was walked through the side entrance, the one used for detainees, fingerprints, and booking. Fluorescent light, cracked tile, the institutional smell of disinfectant, and something underneath it that was harder to name. Foley looked up from the desk. His eyes moved over her in the habitual, cataloging way of a man who had looked at too many faces in this room. Possession, felony grade, Holt said. Probable cause stop on 9. Cocaine, 2 to 3 grams, found in the passenger compartment. Foley nodded, pulled the booking form. Standard. Delgado began the intake process. She was asked to empty her pockets. From her right pocket came a folded $10 bill and a gas station receipt. From her left pocket came a small USB drive on a metal ring with no keychain. Nothing else. No phone, Delgado asked. No phone, she confirmed. This was noted with a small frown. Most people had phones. People without phones were either very poor or very deliberate. Delgado reached for the messenger bag. The evidence seal Holt had placed on it had not been broken. Protocol required an inventory search of all items in custody. Delgado opened the bag and began removing items. A small notebook, wire-bound, half filled with handwriting in a tight, economical script. A folded legal pad with printed documents clipped to it. A black ballpoint pen. A protein bar, half-eaten. And at the bottom of the bag, under a flat internal zipper pocket that Delgado had to search for because it was designed not to be obvious, a second wallet. It was different from the first one. Thicker. Stiffer. The exterior was a matte black synthetic material that felt deliberately institutional. Delgado unfolded it and looked at what was inside. He set it down on the processing counter. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man whose internal reasoning has caught on something sharp and unexpected. Then he looked at Claire. She met his eyes. He looked back at the wallet. Inside it was a credential card. Hard plastic, government issue, the particular shade of navy blue and gold that federal agencies use, with a seal embossed on the left side and a photograph on the right. The photograph was unmistakably the woman standing in front of him. The name on the credential card was not Linda Espinoza. The name on the credential card was Special Agent Claire Navarro, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Criminal Investigations Division, Organized Crime and Law Enforcement Corruption Task Force. Below the name was a case number. A 7-digit federal case number beginning with the prefix that indicated it had been issued by the field office in Columbus, Ohio. Delgado's hand moved without his permission, the way hands move when the brain has sent an impulse before the conscious mind has fully articulated the reason for it. His hand moved toward the desk phone. Holt was standing 6 feet away, completing his incident report on the desktop terminal. He heard the motion more than saw it. "What are you doing?" he said. Delgado did not answer immediately. He was still looking at the credential. "Delgado," Holt said, sharper this time. Sergeant, Delgado said, in a voice that had gone very careful and very quiet. I think you need to come look at this. Holt crossed the room in 4 steps. He looked at the counter. He looked at the credential card. He looked at the photograph on it. Then at the woman standing on the other side of the counter with her wrists still cuffed. His face underwent a transformation that was not at all subtle. Color drained from his jaw first, then from the area around his eyes, as if his body were redistributing blood away from his face and towards some more urgent interior system. His lips separated slightly. That's a fake, he said. The words came fast, too fast, the kind of reflex response a body produces before rational thought has time to vet it. Claire Navarro looked at him with the same steady, even expression she had worn since the shoulder of State Route 9. That identification is entirely legitimate, she said. And everything that has occurred in the last 53 minutes has been documented. Holt's eyes moved to the messenger bag, the notebook, the folded legal documents. He thought about the USB drive. He thought about the car, impounded now, sitting in the lot at Callaway's tow yard. He thought about his dashcam footage, which he had not checked and which was always automatically uploaded to the department server at the end of a shift. He thought about his body camera, which he had deactivated before leaving the patrol lot at 11:40, a habit he had developed over the last several years because the captain had never asked about it and nobody on his squad had ever flagged it. He thought about all of these things in the space of approximately 4 seconds, which was not enough time to construct any version of a response that was not already too late. Take the cuffs off, Claire said. Not loud, not theatrical, direct. Delgado reached for his key. Holt moved a half-step forward, some arrested instinct toward obstruction that his body started and his rational mind aborted immediately. He stopped. He stood very still. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead in the silence. Delgado removed the cuffs. Claire brought her hands to the front and rotated her wrists once, a small, precise gesture, and then she stood straight and looked at Holt in a way that made the room feel much smaller. Sergeant Holt, she said, you are currently the subject of an active federal investigation into a pattern of evidence planting, falsified arrests, civil rights violations under color of law, and coordinated criminal conduct within the Calverton Police Department. What you did tonight on Route 9 was not a mistake. It was the 41st documented instance of a pattern that my office has been building a case around for 14 months. The silence that followed was absolute. Foley, at the far desk, had set down his pen. He was not moving. The bag you placed in my vehicle is already part of a controlled documentation protocol, she continued. The material inside it was not cocaine. It was a field test analog, non-narcotic, used specifically to confirm evidence planting behavior. My vehicle's interior was thoroughly swept and documented by federal agents 2 hours before tonight's operation. The dashcam on your unit transmitted to a federal capture server in real time, beginning at the moment you activated your emergency lights. Your body camera status was noted at activation time and again at deactivation, which my team documented remotely from the cell tower data attached to your department-issued radio. Everything you did tonight, every motion, every placement, every word, has been preserved. Holt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Sergeant, she said, I need you to step back from the booking counter, remove your service weapon and place it on the desk, and remain in this room. You are not under arrest yet. That will happen in the next several minutes. But I am advising you that any attempt to leave this building, to access department communications, to contact your supervisor, or to destroy or alter any device in your possession will be considered obstruction and will be added to the charges currently being prepared in federal court. Holt looked at the credential card. He looked at the woman holding it. He looked at Delgado, who had taken a step back and whose expression was the expression of a person watching a building collapse from the outside. He looked at Foley, who was staring at his desk with the motionless attention of a man recalculating everything he had ever chosen to look away from. Holt's service weapon came off his belt in slow motion. He placed it on the counter. He took 1 step back. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the front doors of the Calverton Police Department's central processing facility opened, and 4 people walked through them. 2 were men in dark tactical clothing with FBI stenciling on the back of their vests, carrying themselves with the compact, purposeful economy of agents on a resolved operation. The third was a woman in a dark suit, mid-40s, carrying a brown leather briefcase and a tablet device, who identified herself as Supervisory Special Agent Patricia Wren of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit out of the Columbus field office. The fourth was a man in a gray blazer who was introduced without elaboration as a representative from the Department of Justice. The room had not been a room of authority since the moment Delgado unfolded the matte black wallet. Now it was something else entirely. It was a room under new management. Wren set her briefcase on the booking counter, opened it, and produced a federal arrest warrant. She placed it face up on the surface and turned it toward Holt with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and found no drama necessary in the doing of it. "Marcus Allen Holt," she said, "you are under arrest for federal civil rights violations under 18 U.S.C. 242, fabrication of evidence, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to deprive persons of constitutional rights, and related charges. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Holt stood while one of the tactical agents cuffed him, and in the fluorescent light of the building he had moved through for 17 years, he had the look of a man who was discovering for the first time that the ground he had stood on had always been a ceiling, and he had simply never looked down. He was walked to the back of the room and placed in a holding chair against the wall while Wren continued. From the briefcase came a second arrest warrant, then a third. Wren looked at Foley, who had not moved. "Raymond Foley," she said. The desk sergeant looked up. His face was a map of resignation. "You are not currently being charged," Wren said. "But you are a material witness in an active federal investigation. You will remain in this room and be formally interviewed beginning within the hour. If you choose to be cooperative, that cooperation will be noted in the record. Is that understood?" Foley said yes. His voice came out almost no sound at all. The second and third arrest warrants were for Captain Leonard Briggs, commanding officer of the Calverton PD's Eastern Patrol Division, and for Lieutenant Darnell Cross, Briggs's second in the chain of command. Both men were, at this hour, either at home or at one of two addresses that the federal surveillance team had confirmed for both of them. Agents were already at both locations. Claire Navarro sat down at the processing desk that had, 20 minutes ago, been used to book her. She took the notebook from the messenger bag, uncapped the black pen, and began writing in the same tight, economical script. She did not look at Holt. She did not perform satisfaction in the way that would have been cinematic and false. She simply worked, because the work was not finished and would not be finished for some time. Captain Leonard Briggs was taken into custody at his home on Sycamore Hill Drive at 3:47 in the morning, 31 minutes after Claire Navarro produced her credentials in the processing room. His wife stood in the hallway of their house in a blue robe, one hand pressed flat against the wall, watching the agents lead her husband through the front door in handcuffs. He had not resisted. He had not been awake. He had opened the door after the second knock in the clothes he'd been sleeping in, and when Agent Torres showed him the warrant, he had looked at it for a very long time without saying anything at all. "Can I get dressed?" he'd said finally. "Yes," Torres said. "Agent Mendez will be with you." Briggs got dressed in gray pants and a white shirt, neither of which he buttoned fully, with the slow, careful movements of a man whose hands are not entirely steady. He was 56 years old, 23 years on the department, 12 of them commanding the Eastern Division. He had not planted evidence himself, as far as the federal record showed. What he had done was receive reports, sign off on arrest paperwork, review bodycam exception logs, and never once asked the question that any officer of his rank was legally and professionally obligated to ask. He had enabled. He had protected. He had institutionalized the conditions in which Holt and two other officers under his command had operated for years, and the federal record contained 412 pages documenting his specific actions and omissions in explicit, granular, sequential detail. He said nothing in the car. He looked out the window at the streets of Calverton sliding past in the pre-dawn darkness and seemed to be experiencing something that the agents in the front seat did not discuss. Lieutenant Darnell Cross was not at his home address. He was at an apartment on the west side of Calverton that he maintained under a name he believed was unconnected to his official records. He was with a woman who was not his wife. When the knock came and he looked through the peephole and saw the vests, he apparently spent about 90 seconds in the apartment after the knock, during which time agents later found that he had sent 3 text messages. One to Briggs, which went unanswered because Briggs was already in federal custody. One to Holt, Same result. And one to a number that belonged to a man named Gerald Muir, who was a city councilman representing Calverton's 3rd District and who had, according to the federal case file, been the recipient of $11,000 in unreported cash payments from a property fund that was itself connected to a larger pattern of financial corruption running through the department's evidence room and impound lot operations. Cross opened the door when he was told a second time that if he did not open it, the agents would proceed under exigent circumstances. He came out in jeans and no shirt, his eyes moving fast over the agents at the door, and said, "I want a lawyer." "That is your right," said Agent Torres. "You'll have access to counsel at the processing facility." He was handcuffed in the hallway. The text to Gerald Muir was logged, preserved, and attached to the federal file that was already being compiled at the Columbus field office. It would result, within the following week, in a separate grand jury subpoena. Gerald Muir would resign from the city council 14 days later and enter a cooperation agreement that would ultimately pull the thread on 3 additional individuals connected to a cash skimming operation running through the department's evidence room. But all of that was still ahead, and for now the city of Calverton was beginning to wake up in the thin gray light before dawn with no idea that the ground beneath it had already shifted. Back at the processing facility, the booking room had been converted with quiet efficiency into a functional field staging area. Agent Torres was on a phone call in the corner. Wren was seated at a table reviewing documents with the DOJ representative. Delgado had been moved to an adjacent room and was being pre-interviewed by a junior agent with a digital recorder on the table between them. Holt sat in the holding chair against the wall. He had been sitting there for over an hour. He was handcuffed to a ring bolt on the chair frame. He had said nothing since the moment Wren read him his rights, and his silence had taken on a different quality as the hour progressed. It was no longer the silence of shock. It had become the silence of calculation, the kind of interior arithmetic a person performs when they are trying to determine how much they know and how much others know, and what the gap between those two quantities might be worth. At 4:22, a federal public defender arrived, a woman named Sasha Kowalski who had an unlit cigarette behind her ear and the unhurried manner of someone who worked these hours regularly. She conferred with Holt for 11 minutes in the corner of the room while Wren allowed it without interruption. When Kowalski was finished, she said, to no one in particular, "My client wishes to know if cooperation is on the table." Wren looked up from her documents. "We're prepared to discuss the terms of a formal proffer once the initial arraignment is complete," she said. "This morning." Holt looked at Kowalski. Kowalski looked at Holt. Something passed between them that was not quite hope and not quite surrender, but contained elements of both. The arraignment took place at 8:15 in federal court before a magistrate judge named the Honorable Sandra Okafor, who looked at the arrest documents for Holt, Briggs, and Cross with the concentrated attention of a judge who has seen significant cases before and understands immediately when one is significant in a different way than the ordinary. She read the charges listed on Holt's warrant with particular care. Civil rights violations under color of law. Fabrication of evidence in a criminal proceeding. Conspiracy. The maximum federal exposure on the combined charges ran to 34 years. Holt stood at the defense table in the clothes he had been arrested in. 17-year law enforcement veteran, 17 years of a badge and a gun and the ambient, unquestioned authority of the uniform. And he stood in that courtroom looking neither innocent nor guilty, but simply diminished, as if the room had been correct in size all along, and he was only now finding that out. Briggs stood at the adjacent table. He had buttoned his white shirt by now. He looked like a man at a funeral who cannot quite locate the grief, only the formality. Cross stood at the far table, counsel beside him, and he did not look at either of the other two men. His eyes were on the floor. Judge Okafor set bail for Holt at $250,000. She noted explicitly and for the record that the nature of the charges, specifically the corruption of the justice process and the demonstrated willingness to fabricate criminal evidence, made flight risk and community safety considerations particularly acute, and she attached as a condition of bail a prohibition on any contact with any current or former employee of the Calverton Police Department and an immediate suspension of any and all law enforcement credentials. Bail for Briggs was set at $300,000 with similar conditions and an additional prohibition on contact with any city government official. Cross's counsel requested a bail reduction hearing. Judge Okafor, gave counsel 48 hours to file the request. She moved on. The hearing lasted 31 minutes. When it was over, the three men were separated and moved to the federal holding facility pending their respective counsel's bond arrangements. None of them made eye contact with each other as they were let out. The particular conspiracy that had held them together for years had dissolved with extraordinary speed once the walls of the courtroom closed around them, because that is how these things always go. The structure that appears solid from the inside reveals itself, under legal pressure, to be a collection of individual interests that were never truly aligned. The Calverton Police Department was placed under a federal monitoring order by noon that same day. An interim commander, a retired federal law enforcement administrator named Davis Keller, was appointed by the city manager to supervise day-to-day operations while the investigation remained active. 14 officers were placed on administrative leave pending review of their individual case histories, specifically any arrests or evidence submissions that overlapped with the pattern identified in the federal file. 2 additional officers, both from Holt's Midnight Patrol Unit, were arrested by federal agents the following day on charges substantially similar to Holt's, bringing the total to 5 law enforcement arrests in 36 hours. The federal case file, portions of which were released through the court's public record system, documented 41 separate incidents in which Marcus Holt had either fabricated evidence, submitted falsified incident reports, or made arrests that forensic review determined to be pretextual. 31 of those arrests had resulted in convictions, because the defendants had either pleaded guilty under the weight of manufactured evidence or had gone to trial against a police officer in a system that had been sufficiently captured to produce reliable outcomes regardless of truth. Of those 31 convictions, 17 involved individuals who had been incarcerated. Attorneys from the Federal Public Defender's Office and from 3 civil rights litigation firms began filing emergency motions for review before the weekend was over. One of the people who had been convicted on fabricated evidence was a 22-year-old named Devin Marsh, who had been arrested by Holt 3 years earlier on a possession with intent to distribute charge and had pleaded guilty under advice of an overworked public defender who had spent exactly 40 minutes with him before the plea date and had told him that fighting a police officer's word in this jurisdiction, with the judge and the DA and the system built the way it was built, was a long bet. Devin had taken 4 years. He had served 31 months. He was out now, working at a materials warehouse on the south side of Calverton, living with his mother, and trying to rebuild something from what the system had left him. He learned about the federal case from a former public defender who reached him by phone on a Thursday afternoon while he was eating lunch in the warehouse break room. He sat very still on the bench in the break room with the phone pressed against his ear, and when the attorney told him that the evidence in his case had been fabricated and that his conviction was being reviewed for emergency vacatur, Devin Marsh did not cry or shout or react in any of the ways the people around him might have expected. He said, "I knew it," very quietly, the way a person says something that has lived inside them for years and has finally been given permission to be spoken aloud. He said, "I knew it the whole time." There were 16 others with a similar story, and they were being reached by attorneys in the same way, one by one, across the city, over those first few days of the unraveling. The press coverage began within hours of the arraignment, starting with a single post from the Calverton Ledger's courthouse reporter who had seen the federal docket appear at 8 in the morning and understood immediately what she was looking at. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by the wire services and was moving nationally. By evening, it was leading the regional news broadcasts in language that had not been applied to the Calverton Police Department publicly before, language about systemic corruption and fabricated arrests and years of institutional cover, language that people in the eastern part of the city and on the south side, and in the neighborhoods along the river, had been using in private for a very long time. The interim commander, Davis Keller, held a press conference on the steps of the main precinct building on Friday afternoon. He stood at the microphone in the late summer heat and spoke plainly, without the bureaucratic insulation of language designed to minimize. He said that what had occurred in this department was a serious and sustained violation of the public trust. He said that accountability, not management of perception, was the governing priority. He said that the review process would be thorough and that individuals who had been wrongfully convicted would receive the full legal resources of the city in the review and remediation of their cases. He said these things, and several people on the steps and on the sidewalk watched him say them. And the watching was complicated, as the watching always is when institutions announce that they are finally taking seriously the damage they have long pretended was not occurring. Claire Navarro was not at the press conference. She had been at the Columbus field office for 2 days, completing reports and post-operation documentation by the time Keller stood at that microphone. Her role in the arrest of Marcus Holt and the subsequent chain of events was by then a matter of federal court record, but she gave no interviews and made no statements beyond what the case required. She was a federal agent, and the operation had been one data point in a larger architecture of accountability, and she treated it as such. She did meet, once, with Devin Marsh. It was not an official meeting, not part of any protocol, and it was brief. It happened in a small conference room at the city's new community oversight office that had been established in the immediate wake of the federal monitoring order. Claire was there for a collateral interview related to the evidence room skimming investigation. Devin was there with his attorney reviewing the vacator paperwork. They met in the hallway, by accident, in the way that consequential things sometimes happen without staging. His attorney introduced them. Devin looked at her, a direct look, the same kind of direct look she had given Holt in the booking room, though the content of it was entirely different. "You were the one on Route 9, he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking about something complicated and arriving at a simple conclusion. "Did you know about me?" he said, "before that night?" "Your case was one of 41 in our file," she said. "Yes." He absorbed that. The conference room behind him had voices in it, and the sound of paper being organized. The hallway was quiet by comparison. "My kid was 3 months old when I went in," he said. "She's 4 now, and she doesn't know how to say my name right yet." He paused. "She calls me Dev. Claire did not look away and did not perform a response. She said, "I know." It was not a comfort. It was not meant to be a comfort. It was an acknowledgement, which is what people need when they are past the place where comfort is adequate. Devin nodded again. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him gently back toward the conference room. He went without resistance. This young man, carrying 4 years that didn't belong to him, carrying 31 months of his daughter's life that he had watched through institutional glass, carrying the weight of having been right the whole time in the worst possible way. Claire walked the other direction down the hallway. The federal trial of Marcus Allen Holt commenced 7 months later in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio. The process had taken longer than it might have, because the indictment had expanded significantly in the months between his arrest and the trial date, accumulating charges across a broader pattern of conduct that the investigation had continued to document. By the time the trial opened, Holt faced a superseding indictment of 23 counts, including racketeering charges that tied him to the evidence room cash skimming operation through a chain of financial relationships that federal prosecutors had assembled with meticulous precision. He had, at one point, been offered a plea agreement. His attorney had negotiated specific terms. The government's counteroffer had required full cooperation against Briggs, Cross, and Gerald Muir, testimony regarding the broader evidence room operation, and a guilty plea to a minimum of 8 counts. Holt had declined the offer. He had declined it in the particular way of someone who still believed, even after everything, that the system he had once commanded was a system he could still navigate. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions. The trial lasted 19 days. The government's case was built on the documented evidence from Claire Navarro's 14-month investigation, supplemented by dashcam footage, cell tower records, financial transaction histories, testimony from 11 witnesses including 3 former officers who had accepted cooperation agreements, and the meticulous forensic reconstruction of 41 individual incidents that, taken together, constituted a pattern of criminal conduct as organized and deliberate as any enterprise the federal racketeering statute had been designed to address. The evidence-planting case from Route 9 was presented on the 3rd day. The government played the dashcam recording from Holt's patrol unit. The footage was clear. The placement of the bag was clear. Holt's body position, the angle of his arm, the 11-second window of time in which the bag appeared in his hand and was then deposited into the passenger compartment, all of it was clear. A forensic video analyst from the FBI's laboratory in Quantico testified for 2 hours about frame-by-frame reconstruction of the footage, pixel-level enhancement of the evidence placement, and the specific trajectory analysis that established beyond any interpretive ambiguity where the bag came from. Claire Navarro testified on the fourth day. She sat in the witness box in a dark blue blazer and spoke with the same measured, precise quality that had characterized every action she had taken from the moment Holt activated his lights on Route 9. She answered the prosecution's questions with exact, factual specificity. She answered the defense's cross-examination with the same quality, deflecting attempted characterizations with a calmness so total that defense counsel eventually abandoned the line and moved on. Holt sat at the defense table through 19 days of this and looked, progressively, smaller. Not literally. He was the same broad, dense man he had always been. But the room had a different geometry than the booking room on Merchant Street or the patrol car or the stretch of Route 9 at 3 in the morning. In those spaces, he had been the largest thing. In this room, he was not. On the 17th day, his former captain, Leonard Briggs, took the witness stand as a cooperating government witness. He had accepted a plea agreement in the 4th month of the investigation, entering guilty pleas to 2 counts of obstruction and 1 count of conspiracy, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. He was facing 30 months in federal prison under the terms of the agreement. He took the stand in a gray suit and testified for a full day about the culture of the Eastern Patrol Division, about specific conversations he had had with Holt regarding evidence procedures, about incident reports he had reviewed and signed off on that he had known were problematic and had chosen not to flag. He testified about the specific meeting 3 years ago in which Holt had told him, in direct language, that he had a system for handling difficult stops, and about Briggs's response to that information, which had been to say nothing and to do nothing, and to thereby allow the system to continue. The courtroom listened to this testimony with the particular attention that a room gives to a confession, even when the confession comes in the language of legal procedure and is shaped by the interests of a cooperation agreement. There was weight in it regardless of its context. Holt testified in his own defense on the 18th day over the strong advisory of his counsel, who had by this point exhausted most other defensive options. He took the stand and for 4 hours offered an account of the events of Route 9 and of the 41 prior incidents that contradicted the physical evidence, the video evidence, the financial records, the witness testimony, and the basic structure of verifiable fact in ways that the government dismantled on cross-examination with such methodical completeness that by the end of the 4th hour several jurors had stopped writing notes because there was nothing further that required recording. The jury deliberated for 6 hours across 1.5 days. They returned a verdict on a Tuesday afternoon in the kind of flat, gray autumn light that does not make anything beautiful. Guilty on all 23 counts. Holt stood at the defense table when the verdict was read and did not move and did not speak. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, the reflexive gesture of counsel who has done what they could and is now simply providing presence. The government attorneys at the prosecution table made no outward display. The people in the gallery, some of whom had driven in from the south side and the east side and the other parts of Calverton that Holt had spent 17 years patrolling, sat with a variety of expressions that ranged from relief to grief to something that could not be categorized as either. Devin Marsh was not in the courtroom. He had been told by his attorney that he was not required to attend and that his interests were represented in the proceeding through the documentary record and the conviction itself. He was at work. He was at the materials warehouse on the south side, moving pallets in the loading area, working the afternoon shift on a Tuesday in autumn when his daughter's name in his mouth still tasted like the most important thing in the world. His attorney called him after the verdict. Devin listened, and when the call was over he set the phone back in his pocket and stood in the cold air of the loading dock for a moment, not performing anything for anyone, just standing and breathing and allowing himself to occupy the specific feeling that comes when a thing you have waited too long for finally happens. It did not give him back what he had lost. No verdict could do that, but it confirmed what he had always known, which was that the truth existed and could be documented and could, if you were patient and if you were believed by the right person at the right time, eventually be made into something that the law was required to recognize. Sentencing for Marcus Holt took place 3 months after the verdict, on a Wednesday morning in January. The federal sentencing guidelines for the combination of charges, accounting for the scope of the conduct, the number of victims, the abuse of a position of public trust, and the absence of any acceptance of responsibility produced a calculated range that the government's sentencing memorandum argued should be followed without downward departure. Defense counsel's sentencing memorandum argued for various mitigating factors, including Holt's service record, his family circumstances, and what was described as the extraordinary nature of the federal investigation that had caught him. Judge Sandra Okafor, who had presided over the arraignment and had subsequently been assigned the full case, read both memoranda with evident care. She sentenced Marcus Holt to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. She ordered full restitution to identified victims pending the civil damages proceedings that were already moving through federal court on parallel tracks. She stripped him permanently of any law enforcement certification in any jurisdiction in the United States. She spoke briefly before announcing the sentence, in the measured, deliberate way of a judge who understands that the words of sentencing carry a weight beyond the legal function they perform. She said that the crimes of law enforcement officers are of a particular character, not because officers are different people from other defendants, but because the authority entrusted to them was entrusted specifically for the protection of the public, and the deliberate corruption of that authority constitutes a harm not only to its individual victims, but to the structural integrity of the justice system itself. She said that every person wrongly arrested, wrongly convicted, and wrongly imprisoned by fabricated evidence represents not only an individual injury, but a systemic one, because each false conviction consumes the resources and the credibility of a system that depends on public trust to function. She said that the sentence she was imposing was not punitive in any personal sense, but was rather the natural consequence of a course of conduct that had been sustained, documented, deliberate, and devastating. She said these things in the quiet voice of a judge who has seen a great deal of what people do to each other, and her voice carried the weight of all of it, and the room was still and attended to every word. Holt was taken into custody immediately following sentencing. The civil damages proceedings that followed, brought by the 17 individuals whose convictions had been vacated and by the families of several others, resulted in settlements totaling $11 million paid by the city of Calverton and its insurers. The city also established a formal wrongful conviction review board, jointly managed by the city, the state public defender's office, and a coalition of civil rights organizations that had been advocating for such a mechanism for nearly a decade. The review board's first act was to commission an independent audit of all convictions in Calverton involving any officer who had been identified in the federal investigation. The audit took 2 years. It identified an additional 9 convictions requiring review, 7 of which were subsequently vacated, and 2 of which involved defendants who had completed their sentences but were awarded certificate of innocence documents that could be used in their civil proceedings. Gerald Muir, the city councilman who had received unreported payments and had received Darnell Cross's text in the hours after Claire Navarro's arrest, entered a guilty plea to federal corruption charges and was sentenced to 37 months. He served his sentence and did not return to public life in any official capacity. Darnell Cross, who had cooperated extensively after his initial arrest and had provided testimony that had been instrumental in the financial corruption case, received a sentence of 5 years under the terms of his cooperation agreement and served 38 months before being released on supervised release. The 2 officers from Holt's Midnight Patrol Unit who had been arrested in the days following his own arrest were each sentenced to federal prison terms of 11 and 14 years respectively. They had been operating under the same pattern Holt had established, and the government's case against them had the benefit of the extensive documentation the Route 9 investigation had produced. The Calverton Police Department, under the federal monitoring order and with Davis Keller as its interim commander and then its appointed director, spent 2 years in a process of structural reform that was genuinely difficult and only partially successful, because institutional reform of that kind is always partially successful in the short term. Because the institutions are made of people, and the people were not all arrested, and some of the people who were not arrested were part of the culture that had allowed the arrested ones to operate for years. But the monitoring was real and the documentation was ongoing and the oversight had teeth, and what was happening in Calverton was now visible in a way it had not been before, and visibility was not reform, but was the precondition for it, and that was something. In the late spring of the year following Holt's sentencing, Devin Marsh had his conviction formally vacated in a brief court proceeding that lasted 12 minutes. He stood with his attorney, and a judge he had never met signed an order, and the record that had followed him since he was 22 years old was cleared. He received a formal apology from the city, which was read into the record by a city attorney in the language of official statements, precise and formal, and not quite adequate. Devin listened to it with the same stillness he had brought to every official proceeding he had been part of since the first one, the one where a public defender had told him to take the plea. His daughter was in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was 4.5 years old. She had learned to say his name correctly, but she still called him Dev because she liked it and because it made him smile every time, and she was at an age where making someone you love smile is one of the most interesting things in the world. When the door opened and he came out into the hallway, she ran at him in the sudden, fully committed way of small children who have not yet learned to hold anything back. He caught her and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he stood in the courthouse hallway. This young man who had been right the whole time in the worst possible way and had lived through it anyway. And he did not feel like a symbol of anything, and he was not thinking about justice in any abstract sense. He was thinking about his daughter's weight in his arms, the specific and unrepeatable fact of it. The Route 9 dashcam footage from Holt's patrol unit was entered into the federal record and became, over the months and years that followed, one of the more extensively studied pieces of evidence in federal law enforcement training programs focused on the documentation of misconduct. The 11 seconds of footage, the casual motion of a man so accustomed to impunity that he had not even considered the possibility that the woman he had pulled over might be the person who had been watching him for 14 months, became a reference point in discussions about the nature of systemic confidence and what happens when that confidence encounters a system better organized than the one it belongs to. Claire Navarro returned to the Columbus field office and continued her work in the public corruption unit. She took on 3 additional cases in the 18 months following the Calverton operation, cases involving different cities and different officers and different patterns of the same essential thing. She did her work with the same quality she had brought to all of it: methodical, patient, and possessed of the particular kind of attention that does not flinch from what it finds because the finding is the point. She did not think often about the 11 seconds on Route 9. She thought about Devin Marsh's daughter more than she thought about Holt. She thought about the 17 other people whose lives had been bent by fabricated evidence, and the 9 more the audit had found, and the uncountable further number who existed somewhere in the gap between what had been documented and what had actually occurred. She thought about the gap the way she thought about all the work still ahead of her. Not with despair, because despair is not a useful instrument, but with the clear-eyed recognition that the work has a shape larger than any single case, and that the shape requires people willing to be patient enough to work it for as long as it takes, from the inside of a gray Honda Accord on an empty road at 3 in the morning if that is what the work requires. There is a version of accountability that is loud and immediate and satisfying in the way of a film's final scene. All consequences delivered on cue, justice arriving in clean, irrevocable waves. The events in Calverton were not quite that version. They were the other version. The one where accountability is real but ragged, where justice comes in stages over months and years, where some things are repaired and other things remain broken, and the difference between those two categories is itself a form of testimony about what the system is and what it is capable of becoming. Where a woman drives a gray Honda at 52 miles per hour through a corridor of sodium light and waits, with absolute patience, for a man's certainty in his own impunity to fully express itself. Because impunity requires invisibility. And the moment it is seen, clearly and without flinching, by someone who knows exactly what they are looking at, the architecture beneath it begins to give way. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic collapse. But the giving way begins. And once it begins, the direction of it cannot be reversed. Marcus Holt had pulled over 41 people before Claire Navarro. He had performed the same motion, 11 seconds, the same casual placement, the same certainty that the word of a sergeant on the midnight patrol was the only word that would ever matter. He had been right about that for 17 years. He had been wrong about it once. That once was the only time that needed to happen. Some things only need to happen once to become inevitable,